The realism and the careful plotting we found in 19th century short fiction, notwithstanding Chekhov's more open plot in The Lady with the Dog, take a decided turn as we make our way into the 20th century and modernism. The story Araby is from a collection of stories by James Joyce called Dubliners, first published in 1914. The third story in the collection and one of the best-known ones in the volume, which presents a collection of portraits of a desolate and grimy Dublin with lives of ordinary Dubliners, and also a view of the religious entrenchment of the Catholic Church. Born in 1882 in Dublin, Joyce, one of the 20th century's most respected and venerated writers, became an expatriate, lived in Zurich, Trieste, Pula, Rome, and ultimately in Paris. He was a cosmopolitan in his living quarters, but returned inevitably to his roots and to the regional world of Dublin. He was educated in Jesuit schools and at University College Dublin, but left both nation and the Catholic Church to devote his life to literary art. Like Henry James, he spent his life devoted to literary art, and he wrote famous novels, perhaps the century's most famous, Ulysses, as well as the semi-autobiographical Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man and Finnegan's Wake. He's best known for his inventive and original use of language, his mastery of the stream of consciousness technique that was also used by writers like Virginia Woolf and William Faulkner, his use of archetypes, myth, and what he called the epiphany, a word that he made famous, and what this represents is a moment of a revelation of truth for a character in a story. Both the use of myth and archetype and epiphany all are prominently used by Joyce in his classic masterpiece story, Araby, which is a tale of Irish poverty, the constriction of the Catholic Church, and a young boy's disillusionment with romantic idealism, the kinds of things we came to associate with the work of James Joyce. In the opening paragraph of Joyce, just to get a feel for him, of the story Araby, North Richmond Street, being blind, was a quiet street except at the hour when the Christian Brothers School set the boys free. An uninhabited house of 2 stories stood at the blind end, detached from its neighbors in a square ground. The other houses of the street, conscious of decent lives within them, gazed at one another with brown, imperturbable faces. Now here's Joyce setting us up for, well, not only the street, where the action takes place initially in the story, but telling us that the street is blind and giving us a whole sense of its people simply not seeing what they should be seeing, and making the houses personified as living with decent lives, or being somehow even cognizant of having decent lives within them. Brown, imperturbable faces, he tells us, conscious of decent lives, gazing with imperturbable faces. Now, what does this all suggest to us? It suggests certainly a setting of a street, but then you have the Christian Brothers setting the boys free. So there's that feeling right away of a kind of blindness and imprisonment and living a decent life or trying to live a decent life. But what might be behind that attempt to live a decent life? And what might be forcing or compelling these particular Dubliners on North Richmond Street to live a decent life? This is all part of the Dublin setting. And the Dubliners, the whole collection, is important in providing a kaleidoscopic picture of impoverished lives and lives that are repressed. We never even discover the name of the narrator, nor do we discover the name of the young woman he adores. And by the way, a lot of modern literature puts us into this world of namelessness. James' story even has a nameless narrator, the real thing. But particularly when we find that identity becomes tenuous and vulnerable and fragile as we move into the 20th century, people don't necessarily have names in stories, or at least main characters don't have names. North Richmond Street, where Araby initially takes place, is a decent neighborhood, though it's dilapidated. And described as blind, and early on in the story, we get the picture of children playing in shadows. Within this picture begins a young boy's quest. Magnan's sister, that's all she's known as. She's never given a name. His romantic icon simply tells him that she can't go to the bazaar called Araby. When she tells him this, he commits himself to going to Araby and bringing her back some worthy treasure from this exotic-sounding destination. Melded into his quest are associations with knights who go offer damsels, and the mention of his chalice in the story evokes the Holy Grail. But what begins with the rush of feelings of romantic love turns into an initiation into a kind of darkness. It's not like Hawthorne's Goodman Brown, who was initiated into the dark woods of Calvinist horror, but it's a literal darkness, overshadowed by poverty and Catholicism and the boy's feelings of vanity. With his uncle's late arrival home, his journey to Araby began much later than he wanted or hoped for, and his epiphany at the bazaar is one of disillusionment as he faces a mercantile-minded salesgirl flirting with two gentlemen with English accents. Araby is a coming-of-age story. It's a story of adolescence. It's a journey of discovery or quest of a young boy smitten by what he believes is love, only ultimately to be disappointed and really transfigured by disillusionment. I want to tell a story that's instructive here of my own, adolescent falling in love with love. I think of myself as Romeo before he met Juliet with Fair Rosaline, because Romeo, if you remember the famous play by Shakespeare, was in love with love. And so is this boy. He's taken with the romantic image of love. He's taken with an adoration of Magnan's sister, which has all of the earmarks of being romantic and inflated with all that romanticism can do. And I think many people can certainly relate to this from their own adolescence, and I can. There was a young woman who I knew for a number of years, who I felt, Goethe has a character named young Werther who suffers the sorrows of unrequited love. It's kind of painful, but at the same time strangely pleasurable. And I thought I was in love with this young woman. And I remember being at her home because we were friends, and she saw me more as a friend than as a potential romantic figure. Maybe that was part of the appeal of the unrequited love. And I tell this story because it really dovetails nicely with Joyce's figure in the story Araby. I remember being at her home, and she suddenly took a piece of spiral notebook paper out of her notebook and very casually just pressed her lips. She had that kind of thin lipstick that girls wore in that era. Pressed her lips onto the page, blotted her lipstick, in other words, and casually threw it into the wastebasket receptacle. Then she went out of the room a little bit after that, and I dove, at least that's how I remember it, went very quickly in to grasp this piece of paper to take it as some kind of a remembrance, as something that I could cleave to from her. This is exactly what goes on with the young boy in the story. That is, when she tells him about wanting to go to Araby, he cleaves to that whole idea of going to Araby for her, of making it his mission, of making it his raison d'etre, his reason for existence. And he finds stumbling blocks along the way. As I said, his uncle comes home late, lives with his uncle. And there isn't really necessarily a lot of money in this family, and so he's given a very little, paltry sum of money. And he goes out and meets with disappointment, and meets with a realization or epiphany of what his life is really like, of what the hard straits that he lives under and the circumstances of his life really truly represent. The story is an awakening, but it also represents a loss of, a kind of romantic idealism, similar to the trajectory of what was occurring in the literature of the time as it moved away from romanticism to really a more harsh realism and to modernism. Araby is built, like all the stories in Dubliners, around the idea of the epiphany. Each of these stories has a different kind of epiphany. Let me get a little more into this term and what it means, because it's an important one. And people speak very casually about having an epiphany, like I had an epiphany, like the proverbial light bulb going over the head in a cartoon, or I had an idea that came to me. But it means something deeper than that. It usually means a realization that has a real illumination to it. In fact, it comes out of theology. It comes out of an ephemeral moment of spiritual-like revelation that's sudden and abrupt and can manifest itself in vulgarity of speech. By vulgarity, I mean the speech of the vulgate, the common person speech, just in a gesture and a memorable expression of the mind. We experience it through the boy's enlightenment at the conclusion of the story. That is, we as readers experience it. But one of the things that makes Araby such a rich story is the boy is experiencing an epiphany as well. And the epiphany has to do really with a sense of what his life has been and what his life really is. Call it the real thing, if you like. Irish Catholicism is at the heart of this story. It infuses its meaning, as does the concomitant binary theme of fantasy and the romantic world of the imagination, set really against the religious world of Irish Catholic practice, the actual tawdry world in which the boy lives. These are all pretty much juxtaposed for us. That is, on the one hand, you have the serious religiosity of the Christian brothers and the school. On the other hand, you have the boy's wild, feral, romantic imagination, which wants to set him free, as the first paragraph suggests. The Christian brothers set them free because they're imprisoned in that world of repression, of religion. In fact, Magnan's sister is also very much devoted to religion. She wants to go to the bazaar, but it turns out that she can't go to the bazaar because there's a religious convent meeting that she has to attend. Early on, what we sense then in this story is all of this, call it institutional imprisonment. It's really a metaphor for their lives. It's as if the church casts a very big shadow, and you can see why Joyce was viewed as a heretic in his time, why he was viewed with a great deal of scorn and contempt, in fact, for taking such a strong, irreligious, and what was seen as very impious view of the power of the church over individual lives, over the romantic imagination of an adolescent. There is a former tenant in this story, we discover. The family's former tenant. Wasn't uncommon, in fact, for families to sublet or to have boarders, as they were called in the United States. And he left behind the romantic works of Sir Walter Scott, including a yellow-leaf memoir of Vidocq, and that's an escape from the isolated and musty life associated with another work which is left in his room, but with no one to inherit, the narrator tells us, a work called The Devout Communicant. And even in that back room, which is just mentioned almost seemingly as not even being all that relevant to the love that the narrator feels for Magnan's sister, we come to realize the blending of Sir Walter Scott, who was a romantic writer, in a priest's room with the devout communicant, with, in other words, the way to live a devout life and the rules and strictures that one should follow if one is indeed worthy of being called a good and devout Catholic. And we have Magnan's sister and her brown-clad figure, and remember the imperturbable faces of the street are also brown, casting this boy's imagination, summoning what he calls, at the end of the story, when he has his epiphany, his foolish blood. Nothing frivolous or worldly or tied to a lustful or romantic or love-seeking spirit can emerge from what is the nearly ubiquitous power of the church, or the drabness of the world of Dublin that Joyce gives us, or the decent homes, or even the streets which appear to be hostile to romance. Begin to realize that in Joyce a whole world opens up to you. It's Dublin, it's provincial, it's Irish, it's Catholic, but what he is allowing us to immerse ourselves in, what he is indeed immersing us into, is a boy's world on the one hand, but also the world of all these conflicting emotions, of the inner life and the outer life, of course, but deeper than that, of human longing and yearning. And we're looking at a time when indeed writers like Joyce were becoming more aware of the nature of repression and the nature of not only repression by institutions like the Catholic Church, but repressions that came from attempts to follow or abide by sometimes what seemed like devout or could be harsh morality. At one point, the boy's teacher's countenance, we're told, turns to sternness at the perception that he's becoming idle, thereby presumably inviting the mind to be the devil's playground, which of course is precisely the point, again, of this polarization, of this dichotomy. Because on the one hand, he's longing for, yearning for some kind of romantic love with Magnan's sister, a connection with her, a way to really receive her attention, idolizing her, and it's taking his mind away from being devout. It's taking his mind away from his studies. It's unrepressing him. It's, maybe you could say, liberating him. There is so much of the presence of the church in this story. The boy's aunt, for example, wants to make sure Araby is not some Freemason affair. Mrs. Mercer character who's mentioned in the story, we're told collects stamps for some, quote, pious purpose. But here's a story that immerses us in modernism. And one can't separate the modernist movement from criticism of the church and other powerful institutions. Even in a poem like The Wasteland, written by the very serious Anglican T.S. Eliot, he talks, for example, about the unreal city, as Eliot does. And so there are writers who are bringing us into an awareness of the force of religion, taking more of a stance toward secularism, but also showing the kind of urban decay, the mechanization tied to the industrialism of the age, the unreal city, as Eliot calls really all the major cities of the world in The Wasteland. The modernist view is also tied profoundly to disillusionment. Disillusionment with romanticism, and tied to the themes of waste and spiritual desolation that also run really quite strong in Joyce's story. And that's despite the fact that so much of the modernist view appeared soon after the First World War, and Araby and Dubliners appeared before it. The point of view in this story is rather complicated because it's that of a man looking back on his moment, adolescent disillusionment. And thus, Araby has the kind of modernist complexity of a point of view which is simultaneously both in the present and in the past. Well, that's true of Montrezor in Poe's The Cask of Amontillado. He's also looking back, but he does so to brag, to justify, even as he inadvertently exposes other parts of himself, unwillingly. This is different in Joyce. In Joyce, you have the epiphany. In Poe, there's no moment of self-realization or illumination for Montrezor, but in Joyce, there is. Now, is that moment of realization coming to the young man when he is an adolescent? Or is it coming from the perspective of an adult when he's remembering his adolescence? Or is it both? You could certainly make the case that it is indeed both. That he is experiencing this adolescent epiphany, which he's also allowing us to experience as an epiphany, but that also embedded in the story is the realization that this is an epiphany that comes with understanding at a later age as well. And so we have one of those moments in fiction where the past and the present coalesce, where they almost become fused one with the other, where there's a simultaneity of the past and the present being experienced through the narrative voice, through memory, and through a re-evocation of what occurred. This is a story that's replete with symbolism that would become one of the hallmarks of the modernist movement. It goes back to figures like Flaubert and Baudelaire. Symbolism with multivalent associations and meanings, and symbolism with really a greater depth of meaning and association than the symbolism that we found in earlier work. There is, for example, I mentioned the priest. He lives in a musty room. He has a rusty bicycle pump which is found underneath a bush. And you start thinking to yourself, what is Joyce emblemizing here? What is he symbolizing? Here's a priest who hid this bicycle pump as if to give air under a bush or abandon it there. It's not clear, but nevertheless it's rusty. And those books certainly, as I suggested, give us a whole sense of his dichotomized or his binary world, the romantic of Sir Walter Scott and the devout communicant. And in the backyard, where the priest is, there's what we call a prelapsarian symbol. It's right out of Genesis, right out of the Bible. There's a wild garden with a central apple tree, and you can't get any more Genesis-like than that, although there's also that bush, and underneath that bush is that rusty bicycle pump. And so we have a tableau which is rich in symbolism, and which really strikes a chord as being more modernist than the kind of symbolism that we associate with earlier stories. There's a tendency, in fact, among, well, perhaps many adolescents, I'm thinking high school students, but even among university students, to think symbol means one thing, it stands for. Faith's pink ribbons in Hawthorne's story, for example, her innocence. Pink takes on a much greater and different meaning as we move into the 20th century, though precisely the point. But symbolism and modernism, as they kind of coalesce, suggest meaning that goes out like a ripple in a stream when you toss a pebble in, that radiates out in different directions and suggests many meanings. and goes back intertextually to things like the Bible. This story, after all, is a journey or a quest, and that takes us back in time to so many stories. It takes us back to knighthood quests, as I suggested, quest for the Grail. The boy in the story wants to follow his blood. He wants to move away from this repressive Catholic world of Dublin, to bring back something from the East. Araby, for Magnan's sister, the girl he believes he's in love with. And Araby, the bazaar he wishes to journey to, is associated with just this kind of exoticism, with Eastern enchantment, with magic. Even at the mention of the word Araby, the boy's uncle, just at the mention of the name, is ready to recite the Arab's farewell to his steed. There's imagination in Dublin, but it's imagination that has been overshadowed by, and continues to be overshadowed by, this need to keep emotion in check, to keep yearning and longing under guard, under sentry. Waiting and anticipating the journey, he keeps this image of Magnan's sister in front of him. It accompanies him, it obsesses him. And he imagines bearing a chalice through a throng of foes as he moves through the noisy, flaring Dublin streets of bargaining women, drunken men, cursing laborers, and the nascent violent politics reflected in the street singers' songs of the violent hero of the fight for Irish independence, Dynamite Rossa, whose real name was Jeremiah O'Donovan. So what's the meaning of this journey and where it takes the boy to his epiphany? He creeps past ruinous houses, though also passes a twinkling river, and he travels on this romantic errand in a third-class carriage of a deserted train with very little money in his pocket. The romantic aura that he would like to have fixed upon his journey begins to be diminished just in the journey itself, before he even gets to the bazaar. And the bazaar turns out to be an ordinary shop of dimming lights and shopgirls from no farther east than England, who are, I said mercantile before, they're really concerned only with money. They have purchases to sell, they have items that they want to sell, and that's their job as they see it. They could care less about this boy, his errand, even his presence. Doesn't really affect them at all. They're gossiping and they're talking, and the boy is crushed at the end. Crushed by anguish, by anger, and by feeling derided by vanity. And the importance of vanity here is extraordinary, because it's the real key to his feelings of defeat, since they tie so directly to the Catholic teachings, which he has not been tending to because of the summoning of his blood, as he calls it, to his pursuit of this romantic ideal or this romantic dream. The ambiguity in the story's meaning comes in the fact that the man who is telling the story's attitude toward his epiphanous moment is that of him as a boy surrounded by darkness. Is this the portrait of an artist as a young man, reminiscent of Joyce's Stephen hero or of Stephen Dedalus in Portrait of the Artist as a young man? A man who has grown from his youthful feelings of vanity and derision? Or is he still seeing himself as having been appropriately derided by vanity for his foolish romanticism? As I said, I think you can bring the two together. But you have to ask the question, how much of this young man's past intersects with his present as an adult? There's really every reason to believe, from all that we know of Joyce's early life, that the story has many autobiographical roots to it, and certainly it embodies Joyce's disillusion with the church and with organized religion, and the personal crisis he experienced of loss of faith, as well as his youthful disillusionment with romantic love. One can see in much of the dark short fiction that emerges a kind of reaction against the romanticism that came to be tied to poets like Wordsworth and Keats and Shelley. Though many of our short fiction writers implicitly champion the small and the seeming inconsequential, ordinary people, there's a definite sense of the lack of the kind of belief that many romantic writers had in the transformative powers of the individual. The story has an enduring power to it. There's no accident in the fact that the story is so often read and taught and anthologized. A lot of this has to do with its brevity, but it's also the epiphany and the impact on the reader, as well as the identification with loss that's tied to feelings of youthful folly and romanticism, and that are really based in a story which takes us from romantic idealization of youth to the crushing sense of the real and experience. We move through an initiation into the darkness of modernity. There's a famous play by Eugene O'Neill called Long Day's Journey into Night. No accident that he's an Irish, though American playwright. In fact, O'Neill said, "You can understand me more through my Irishness than anything else." As he moves us from the light into the darkness, it's that kind of movement that we begin to see in the modernism that's reflected in Joyce's story. Goodman Brown finds darkness as well in the forest and the heart of humankind. But it's linked to sin and to loss of faith. While in James Joyce, the specter of the morality of the church and the dingy and dark urban world of Dublin are what oppresses, while the heart of a young boy deeply, and we discover through him foolishly, craves the nourishing food of love and becomes, in his own heart, even if briefly, a knave rather than a knight. We move really more directly into the boy's inner life, as one might surmise occurs in Hawthorne with young Goodman Brown, but for the fact that Hawthorne is there to tell us what Goodman Brown is experiencing. Whereas Joyce's young tortured Irish lad tells us in his own voice, and he makes us experience what he experiences. Less plot-bound than Poe or Hawthorne or Gogol or Maupassant or Henry James, Joyce provides us with a much richer inner life terrain, even as he takes us back in Araby to a kind of transfiguring and powerful sketch. Joyce's influence on the modern short story is inestimable. And he, along with the poet William Butler Yeats, whom many regard as the greatest poet of the 20th century, playwrights like Lady Gregory and Sean O'Casey, they were all singular in hastening an Irish literary revival and literary renaissance. But Joyce, in many ways, is really the central, key, preeminent figure. And this renaissance, this Irish revival, which involved a lot of Celtic revival, would see a spate of short fiction and literary talent in writers like Limo Flaherty, Sean O'Phelan, Frank O'Connor, later on Samuel Beckett, Edna O'Brien, and Mary Lavin. This story is emblematic of Joyce's use of epiphany, but it really carries a major emotional impact as well. The point of view and the voice are both intricate and evocative. The language is richly poetic, and yet it somehow manages to capture the inflation that youth can bring, as when the narrator says of this angel of his confused adoration, and think of the poetry in this, "My body was a harp, and her words and gestures were like fingers running upon the wires." Araby combines two archetypal forms prevalent in fiction, initiation and the journey or mythic quest. Our next story is also an initiation story written by another one of the 20th century's great storytellers, the Russian Isaac Babel, who takes us into the world of war and violence, which, unfortunately, sadly, is often seen as the hallmark of modernism, one of them, and much of the reason short fiction is so often downbeat. Because the short fiction that burgeoned in the first part of the 20th century really followed, in terms of modernism, the First and ultimately the Second World War, and then Vietnam as well. So next, we're going to go to Russia, once again, and read the great initiation and modernist story of violence and of identity, Isaac Babel's My First Goose.